The purpose of this video is to walk through basic color correcting and color grading without using any third-party plugins. Just starting out, something like plugins might be an expense that's not necessarily an option. So doing as much as you can with the basics is an essential mannerism for low-budget filmmakers. So we'll start with color correcting and then work our way to color grading. Now, just to be clear, in this video, we're not going to be covering workflow setup. That's something we'll cover in a future video. But let's jump into color correcting. So here in Adobe Premiere, we have our 3 clips that we're going to color correct. Just by scrubbing through them, you can start to see that they are flat in image. They were filmed with a neutral picture style. So the question to ask ourselves is, what is color correction? Well, the objective of color correction is to take the 3 clips and adjust them so that they look the same to each other. So the first thing we're going to need to do in the color correcting process is readjust our workspace. So we're going to go Window, Workspace, Color Correction. And we might have to adjust the panels as required. So I'm going to move this panel up here, like so. And then we can make them bigger or smaller, whichever way we like. So in this panel here, we have scopes. Now we're going to be using 2 of these scopes for our color correcting process. To see them, just go over the name, right click, and you can see Vector Scope and YC Waveform. Let's start with Vector Scope. Vector Scope is a display in a circular chart similar to a color wheel. It shows the color information. Color or saturation is measured from the center of the chart outward. A very saturated image produces a pattern with some distance from the center. But for example, a black and white image will produce only a dot because there is no color to detect. The particular color presence of the image determines the direction or shape in the color wheel. In the color wheel, we have magenta, blue, cyan, green, yellow, and red. These boxes indicate where a fully saturated image should appear, so the color level should not exceed these boxes. So that's the vector scope. Let's move on to the next scope that we're going to be using, the YC waveform. The YC waveform displays 2 graphs, a green and a blue waveform, which can be toggled here. The green waveform shows brightness, and the blue waveform shows color brightness, which is overlaid the green graph. The X horizontal axis on the graph corresponds to the image left to right. So for example, this is describing the left side of the image, this is describing the center of the image, and then the right side is describing the right side of the image. And along the vertical axis is the brightness intensity, from less to more. Bright objects produce a waveform near the top of the graph. Dark objects produce a waveform towards the bottom of the graph. The brightness levels should be kept within a range of 7.5, which is the dotted line on the bottom, and 100, which is the solid line right along the top. So let's jump into it. With our first clip selected, we're going to go to the Effects tab, Video Effects, Color Correction, Fast Color Corrector, and we're going to drag it into our first clip. So what we'll do is change to the vector scope, and then we're going to scrub through the clip to find a focal point of the clip that we want to color correct. So we'll say right here. So the first thing we're going to do is set the white balance in the effect panel. So you can see white balance with the eyedropper. We'll select the eyedropper and try to find something in the clip that we remember was white. So I remember that this piece of paper was white, and we'll just select that. If you have nothing white in the clip, so you can't set the white balance, we can just skip this step entirely and do it later. The next thing we're going to do is work our way down to saturation. We're going to increase the saturation so that the graph just barely touches the target boxes. So we'll move up the saturation. Right there, 138 seems to be perfect for this clip. Now what we need to do is switch scopes. We're going to right click and select the YC waveform. And now it's time to change the black and white input levels for maximum spread within the limits of 100 to 7.5. So we do that down here with the input levels. So what I'm going to do is move this guy down to bring the blacks down to 7.5. So you can see they're just touching the line now, and we'll bring the whites up so they're just touching around 100. And we can toggle between the blue and green graph to make sure that they look similar, which they do. So it's just around 100 on the top with the whites, and on the bottom it's around 7.5 with the blacks. This is perfect. You might notice that this clip has a very dominant bright presence. There's a lot of waveform along the top of the graph. So I'm going to bring the divider down towards the black to even out the brightness in the clip slightly. Maybe I'll just bump up the whites just a little bit. And we might have to readjust the black slightly, but not too much. So now what we're going to do is go through the rest of the clips and try to do the exact same thing. So we'll try to set the white balance, set the saturation level, and adjust the black and white level inputs. And we're just going to fast forward through this part. So now I've gone through the rest of the clips and applied the same color correction technique. Now what I want to do is switch back to vector scope and scrub through the clips. And what we're trying to notice is the difference in change between tints by looking at the actual screen itself and the vector scope. What I'm noticing is the first clip has a subtle green yellowy tint to it. And then the last clip is maybe a little bit blue tinted. So what we're gonna have to do is fine tune the last clip so it's a little bit yellowy green so it matches the rest of the clips. The way to do that is go Effects, Color Correction, 3-way color corrector, and then drag it onto the appropriate clip. And then we'll go Effects, Controls, minimize our fast color corrector, and here we have our 3-way color corrector. So we'll just expand the panel and just add a slight yellowy green tint to it. And we'll scrub through again looking at the vector scope, so it's slightly touching the yellow side here. This guy has a more dominant yellowy green, but that's because of the bottles in the background, so that's good. I'm pretty happy with that. Now all the clips look the same to each other with regards to lightness and the color. So now we're actually done with color correcting, so let's get out of this workspace layout. So we'll go Window, Workspace, and then we'll go back to editing. So what I've done here is taken all our clips and sort of pre-compose them into their own sequence, so they're all put into one here. So now we're getting ready to do some color grading. So the question is, what is color grading? Color grading is the final look of the film that you choose. Essentially, it's how you stylize your film. Now I'm just going to scrub through again, just like color correction, and find a focal point that I want to color grade to. Let's say this point. Now this is supposed to be a creepy film, so what we're going to do is bring down the saturation of it. So we'll go Effects, Color Correction, and then Color Balance, HLS, and then drag it onto the clip. And then we can bring down the saturation like so. It adds a slight creepiness to it. The next thing I'm going to do is crush the blacks and slightly bring out the blues in the clip. So the way to do that is add a RGB curve, which is in color correction. We'll just drag it onto the clip, and so we'll crush the blacks slightly, and then we'll bring out the blues by bringing this graph slightly up. We're cooling it a little bit. That looks pretty good so far. The next thing I want to do is add the black bars to the top and the bottom, that anamorphic look. So we'll go under Effects, Video Effects, Transform. We're going to try to find Crop, drag it onto the image. We'll minimize RGB curves and color balance, and we're going to crop the top and the bottom by 10%. And there we have our anamorphic bars, further giving it a cinematic look. The next thing you see in a lot of clips is a vignette, and I want to add one here without using an external plugin. So what a vignette is essentially is a fade or a black fade around the edges of the frame. So the way to do that is we're going to go Project, right click, go New Item, Transparent Video. Hit OK, and then we'll bring it into our timeline. And we'll just make it the length of the clip. And now what we need to do is add the circle effect. So we'll go back to Effects, we'll go under Video Effects, Generate, find the circle effect, drag it onto our transparent video, and here we have a circle. So we're going to change the circle to black because that's the color of the vignette we want, and we're going to increase the radius so it just touches the edges. And what we're going to have to do is skew the scale so we can get the left and the right edges as well. So we'll go under Motion, Scale, Uniform Scale, Deselect, and we're just going to increase the scale with regards to width. And then we'll go back to Circle, we'll go Invert Circle, and we'll select Feather and feather the outer edge. And then we'll drop the opacity as well. And there is our vignette. We can turn the layer on and off so you can see it. It's very subtle, but it does add an interesting look to your film. The next thing I want to do is add a diffusion, specifically a black diffusion. So I want to take all the blacks in the frame, isolate them, and cause them to slightly blur out, slightly spill. So this is how we're going to do this. We're going to select our footage, go edit, copy, move to the side of the timeline, go edit, paste. We'll zoom out on the timeline just a little bit. We have our duplicated footage. We'll go unlink, delete the audio portion because we don't need that. We'll take our duplicated video content and just put it right on top. So we have a duplicated version of the video on top of the video. So what we need to do now is isolate the blacks and blur them out. So the first thing we need to do is select the layer that we're going to diffuse the blacks with and desaturate all the color. Make it black and white. And there's a few ways to do that, but I'm just going to use the color balance that we used before through color corrector to desaturate it. So I'll go back to video effects, color correction, color balance, HLS, select it over, and then bring down the saturation as far as it'll go. So now it's desaturated. It is black and white. And now the next thing I want to do is make the blacks and the whites very distinct. So I want to crush the blacks and hardcore brighten the whites. And we can do that through an RGB curve. So we'll select an RGB curve, drag it onto the clip, and exaggerate the blacks and the whites. Perfect. So now what we'll do is minimize our curves and our crop and our balance and all that stuff. And we're going to go to opacity. We want to make sure we deselect the stopwatch because that might cause keyframes, will screw things up. And we want to go to blending mode. Now because we want to do a black diffusion or isolate the blacks in our frame, we're going to use the multiply blending mode, which is right here. So we can select that. So it isolates the blacks and makes everything else, which is white, transparent. Now let's say we wanted to do a white diffusion. You would do the same thing except you would select screen. And that would cause all the whites to be isolated and all the blacks to be made transparent. But we're going to stick with our black diffusion, so we'll go back to multiply. That's looking quite interesting. Now what we're going to do is add finally our blur effect. So we're going to go to video effects, blur, and we're going to try to find fast blur, drag it onto the clip, and then we'll just start to blur it out. And be patient with finding the proper blur for your diffusion. You don't want to rush this. So increase in increments until you get a look that you like. So now what I'm going to do is finally change the opacity of the entire clip. So we'll bring it down. Let's try 30% and see what that looks like. That's a little bit too much. We'll bring it up to, let's say, 60%. That looks very interesting. And then finally, the last thing you want to do is take the crop in the effects and move it all the way down so the crop is added to the diffusion as well. And we can toggle the diffusion on and off so you can see what it looks like with it and without it. So we could play with all the settings and effects here for my color grading, but I'm pretty happy with this look, so we'll call color correction and color grading done. So color correcting is to make sure you have a consistent look throughout your film, and then color grading controls the final tone of your film, both of which are essential. I hope you found this video useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe.